I'm Nikunj Nirmal. I work with Tech Mahindra. I have a couple of responsibilities over there, taking care of digital transformation for all our customers in communications, media, and entertainment business. Along with that, I also run the Makers Lab locally over here. And Makers Lab is essentially our innovation arm, and we have a lot of labs across the globe around that. Majority of the work being still done out of Pune over there. Today, I'm going to talk about how neuroscience inspired AI is progressing and some of the work that is being done in this space today. A lot of this is basically a research done by a company named Numenta, and they have been working on this for almost, I think, 10 plus years now. A guy named Jeff Hawkins, pretty popular. He has been doing a lot of research in his privately funded lab. And what I'm going to present is kind of a summary of the research work that is being done and a little bit of inputs from our side as well along the way. Okay. Just a brief idea about AI, where it is today. There's a lot of excitement in the industry about AI. There's a lot of investment that we are seeing that's happening in the last year. Last, I think, 3 to 4 years has seen an increasing level of investment in AI across the industry. And that's what is being represented. We see a lot of different types of companies at this time. Some of them are really jumping into AI. Some of them are trying to tip their toes and see where it is. And some of them are really skeptical whether it can make a difference at this time. But nevertheless, everybody is taking a notice of that. And I think that's why we all are here spending the whole day talking about it. As it goes, we have been in pretty much all facets of our products trying to get an inspiration from nature, right? And why should AI be any different? So that's the whole concept. While we have been learning from nature and modeling our products around it, our AI should also look at how the brain, specifically the cortex, operates and how we can model our algorithms, our systems in such a way that it is able to mimic the brain and kind of create a universal learning model. So the theory is that the neocortex, which is unique to the human brain, is essentially a single architecture. It uses a very similar or exactly the same algorithm for all the types of learnings. And there was an experiment being performed where in one of the animals, the sensory nerves were actually exchanged. So we have different areas in our brain where you have somatosensory cortex, you have auditory cortex, etc. Right? And they have specific functions to sense the vision, to sense your motor skills, and as well as touch and etc. Now, the sensory nerves were switched, and they could still relearn, and an auditory function could actually now take care of the vision as well. Right? So that's the basic theory behind which it was concluded that the architecture still remains the same. Now, if you look at the reptilian brain, there are certain parts to it. I'll just skip to the fact that in the human brain that you see, there is something called neocortex, which forms about 75% of our brain volume today. And that is what makes us very different and unique and gives us the level of intelligence that the humankind has today. Some of the other brains, like the brainstem, right? It's kind of your autonomous behaviors. What it means is your breathing, heartbeats, etc., are controlled by this, which we are not even conscious of. It just happens. The neocortex, that's where it's separate because it gives the ability to talk, think, create, and learn, and then react to our environment in a very different way. Whereas midbrain, which is also present in the animals, see, they have a feeling. Right? So you see the animals, they are able to react to the environment. They are able to feel what the environment is, and based on that, they are able to react to it. But they don't have an ability to talk or are not very intelligent beings. Now, let's dig a little deeper into the neocortex itself. It's basically a hierarchy of regions. What it means is, if you look at the bottom the bottom part of the screen, there are different regions in it. Neocortex is nothing like but a thin sheet of cloth in a way. It's just 2.5 mm thick, and it's folded out in the brain. So it's the folded structure that we see in the pictures of the brain. Now, it has several layers of. Now, how many layers are there is still being researched at this time. Typically, the agreement is there are about 5 or 6 different layers. But there was a latest research work where it says that there are sub layers in the layer 6 as well. There are sub layers in layer 5 as well. So there is a debate going on in the community. But despite of the number of layers, it's still a hierarchical structure. And what it means is that as you go up the hierarchy, it's able to aggregate all the information and provide more stable predictions or provide more stable understanding of your environment. So essentially, what does the cortex do? It is able to take the light, sound, touch, all the sensory inputs, and is able to process that. And it's able to do it on a regularly fast streaming way. So as I'm talking to you, you're able to understand, you're able to predict to some extent what I'm going to talk about, right? It's because of this that there is a continuous prediction mechanism going on in the brain. It's able to learn from the environment. And then it's able to understand that and also able to create a model of the world. We call it the sensory motor model of the world. And that's the prediction part of it. So the cortical theory is where we are saying that this thin layer, which is the top portion, there are different sheets of cells. And there is a layer, if you look at the central part of it, right, it shows there is a hierarchy. So there could be one part of the brain which is talking about your touch or understanding the touch. Second part is auditory, and third part is vision. Now, vision can by itself take care of a few things. But now if you're trying to, say, watch a movie as well as understand the dialogues of the movie, then you are having basically two different sensory sensory responses coming in together, right? And then you are able to look at it from a hierarchical point of view and make a sense of that environment. So that's what it's talking about. And another important aspect over here is that each region learns in a sequential manner. So it's not that when I look at a picture versus when I'm looking at a movie, right? It's a sequence of different inputs that come in, and I make a sense of those sequences. Even when I'm talking to you, a single word doesn't mean anything, but it's basically the sequence of words that is making sense. So what it means is that we basically learn in a sequential memory format, and our brain stores it as a sequential memory. And there is a context to it. And that's where I think these layers come into picture, and these layers make the sense of it. So this is a little bit of a deeper view on that. Most of your, sorry, go back. Yeah. Say L5, for example. Let's take just one example, motor. So all your motor responses that go out of your body is basically coming from L5. So L4 mostly takes the inferences. It gets all the inputs from the thalamus. Thalamus is the part where you get all the inputs coming out of different parts of the body. And then it tries to make an inference. And based on that, a sequence memory is formed. And each of the region has its own sequence memory. And out of that, when a response is needed, L5 comes into picture. Now it's both ways. L5 also gets the inputs. It's very complex. Sorry, I'm going to go further. So here it says that. So L4 basically gets all the motor sequence inputs, and then it's able trying to predict what's going to happen, or it's trying to predict or make sense of the environment. Now, if it's able to predict it, it can happen right there. It goes to the next higher level. If it's even the higher level is not able to predict it, then think of it, I got a touch. I'm able to predict, I know this is a smooth surface, but there is something which I don't know about it. I have never touched this surface, which means that even layer L2 and L3 is not able to really understand it, which means it needs to further pass on to the higher layers. And that's where the other inputs would come in and try to make sense of it. So this is typically how the neuron looks like, right? This is a picture pretty much we must have all seen from our childhood as well. But the key aspect over here is that there is a feed forward mechanism. What it means is basically it's the inputs that is coming to the neuron. Now, neurons have all this tentacles kind of a thing, right? Basically, they're called the dendrites. Now, the dendrites are either closer, which are called the proximal, or the distal ones. So proximal ones have an ability to spike. When I say spike, it basically activates the neuron. It gets fired. And for a long time, people didn't know what this far off dendrites really did because it didn't really do anything when simulated. But now, I think last decade or so, we know what it does. It essentially depolarizes the cell To simplify, what it really does is it just means that it's able to get the cell in a predictive state. And when it goes into the predictive state, it knows what might happen next. And that's our ability to see. When I'm not even looking and I'm trying to touch at this surface, I predict that this is wood. I already know that. I also know the location where I'm touching. So based on that, I know whether to expect an edge or to expect a smooth surface. So brain not only knows just the touch, but it also knows the location. So it combines a lot of information. It tries to combine a lot of information and does the prediction on a streaming basis on a regular interval. Now, the right picture over here, so that would be probably left for you, is essentially it's the picture of the synapse or the dendrite itself. Now, these are the different dendrites, and the way they get the information is through something called synapses. Synapses are nothing but the connections between the cells. And those are empty spaces. If you look at the miniature picture of that, those are empty spaces through which the electrons fire, and you are able to make those connections out here. And learning is nothing but this formation of the synapses. And that's how you make interpretation and learn. And the way we say whether it's the neuron is being connected through the synapses or not is based on the strength. But we put a threshold on it and say that, okay, the cell is either fired or not fired based on a certain threshold of the strength. Now, so this is the part of where we try to understand how the brain works, what is the structure of the brain. But the second part to it is how does it really store the information? And that's where the theory of sparse distributed representation comes into picture. Today, our computer systems are more or less dense representations. What that means is we have the ASCII representation, 8-bit representation. If you have to write a letter A, for example, it would have a corresponding ASCII. And then you have the bits that represent the letter A. Now, each of the bit in that doesn't really do anything by itself. It's a combination of those bits. So that's why it's a dense representation. Whereas in case of sparse distributed representations, it's essentially a large set of bits, and there are individual bits in that which are represented. And what we are looking for is which bit and which location is active in that. So going back to the example of, say, letter A, what it means is it will not necessarily store the way letter A is stored in the computer system, but it will store different properties of the letter A. Okay, it is sharp, it is pointed, it sounds like this. It's the first letter in the alphabet series, something like that. So those are different properties. And each of this is just a pattern. Again, a bit by itself would not mean anything over here. It's just a pattern that is stored. Probably when you compare that pattern with a letter V, there would be some similarity that our brain would form. That, okay, it is similar, but as well it's inverted. But there is some similarity that we are able to form without anybody even pointing it out at us. Right? So those are some of the properties, and this is how the brain really stores the data. This is essentially the key to solving the problem of how brain really stores the data. And it's essentially not even an algorithm, it's the algorithm that solves all the problems. The data is the algorithm in terms of brain. There's some key properties of SDR. So let's take an example where there are 2000 bits, and even if we go back to our example of, say, letter A or B, then that pattern is stored in terms of a few ones that you see over here. And there are just a few. So typically, if you look at, say, 2000 bits over here, there would be only a very small percentage, maybe 10 or 20%, or 10 or 20 bits out of 2000, which are activated at any point of time. And it's that pattern that the brain remembers. And it being a storehouse, the way it stores is, it's not even this bits. It just remembers the locations of these bits. So it's kind of an index to those locations. But taking that further, since this pattern being on a large scale and just a few bits at a certain locations being active, we don't even need to store this entire set of locations. If there are 40 locations or 40 attributes of letter A that we defined, we don't even need to do that. Probably around 2 to 10% of that might be good enough. And it would still be perfectly okay. And if you look at the probability, if you try to match the letter A again, it would still be an accurate representation, even if it's a small sample of it. just because of the way it is stored. And that's what the theory is that the brain does. Another, sorry, unique property to this is the way union can be done. Now, let's go back to our example of letter A and V. So A is represented, say, for example, in the first line. B is represented in the second line. And then we are trying to make a union of the two. Then it forms a new pattern. Now, there is something that we are seeing over here that it says that, okay, this is how the representation looks like. And there are some common properties to it. That's how the pattern recognition happens. And this is how it interprets all the information, even audio, visual, all of it is just represented in terms of this SDR. That's it. The brain by itself doesn't differentiate between audio versus a visual representation or the patterns. And that's why it is said that there is a single algorithm or a single architecture that processes everything. Now, going back to, so we introduced how the brain works. We talked about what SDR is. Now I'm trying to bring both of it together and say how the sequence memory, because we said that is the key. We are able to understand the world because of the ability to have a sequence memory in our brain. So how does that really work? So the first part on the top, right? The picture that you see is a close-up of the cortex. Now within the cortex, there's a graphical representation of how the different layers are on the third piece. The third diagram that you see on the top, where there are layers of zeros, right? So what we're trying to say over here is that within the cortex itself, there are multiple vertical mini columns, and each of them have a very similar representation of the world. However, there is a horizontal connection that happens across the different columns as well within the cortex, because of which it is able to do the correlation across different problems. And when you look at the neuron itself, so each circle over here or each bit over there is basically the neuron. And within that, the further enhancement to that is the dendrites. These are the ones which activate or polarize or depolarize the neurons. So when we say that a bit is active, essentially the neuron gets fired. And within that whole scale, this is how if you go back to the basic computer memory, that's how it is, 0 and 1, right? It's kind of 0 and 1 over here. But the difference here is that it's stored in relation to something. The SDRs are connected to each other. There is a prediction that has happened, and that prediction is in context to the previous state. So it's not a moment, an absolute moment. It's basically relative to something else, always. And then when we expand it out further, you can see that this is just one representation. There are multiple layers of it, which makes the complexity higher. And then there are hierarchical layers within the brain. And then you see this yellow and red, right? I'll come back to that in detail later. Or what that essentially is, the red ones are the fired neurons, and the yellow ones are the ones which are actually in a predicted state. So there are multiple predictions that have happened for each state at this time. So this is a very simple example. See something, there is a representation of this in the cortex, and there are certain neurons that get fired at a certain point of time. This is the second time when there are certain other neurons got fired right at the next second. Now, to make this sequence memory work, the way it happens is that once a neuron gets fired, it's trying to see that at this point of time, I'm getting fired, but what really happened right before this? What were the other neurons that got fired at that point of time? And it tries to make those active connections with them. So it knows that if this 3 or 4 neurons get fired, this is the state I am in right now. That's how it continuously tries to do the predictions. So because it tries to maintain that state from the brain. So what happens is the way neurons get fired is basically getting the signals from the other neurons because of the synaptic, because of which it knows that I got activated because of these other neurons that were active before me. The way it gets the signals is through other neurons always. Yeah, because that's how the synaptic connections are. So it could be, the first one could be a sensory input that got, but again, that's through neurons. And that's how it predicts the state. And so there is one prediction that has happened now because of this connection. And if you look at it further, this is what the extrapolation of that is. Now that you know that this, and okay, let me go back one more point over here. Critical part is that it doesn't have to know that all other red neurons are connected. It just connects to a few of them. So a sample is okay for it to figure out that this is what is needed for me to predict myself in a certain state. But then this happens on a continuous basis. And what it means is that each action could again have multiple different predictions. So at any point of time, multiple predictions are generated. It's a simple like a game of chess. If you are trying to make a move, the other party tries to see what are the other possible actions that could happen beyond this. Right? So there are multiple predictions that can happen. If I'm moving my hand over here, there are multiple predictions to this. I'll probably hit the laptop, or I'll hit myself, or I'll be turning on the key and the screen would change, something like that, right? So there are multiple predictions that are happening at any point of time. Now, which one is the accurate one would depend on a sequence of events. So that's where the sequence memory builds in. And beyond that, we are also trying to bring in multiple layers. So this is again a simplified view of a single layer. Now, the prediction would get more and more accurate as these inputs go up higher the layer, and then the prediction becomes more stable. This is where we are trying to bring everything together. Right? There are now multiple layers, and different neurons in each of the layers are getting fired. And there would be multiple predictions, and then there is more and more stability coming along over there. And bringing it together. So we were just taking a simple example of one activation. But then at any given point of time, each neuron is capable of doing this for multiple contexts. So it's not just one neuron is reacting to one context. It's able to react to multiple contexts at the same time. It's able to predict its state in terms of those multiple contexts. So it's extremely complex the way it works. And this is what the representation is over here. There is also something called inhibition. So when a certain neuron gets fired, it is able to put certain other neurons in a predictive state. So I got an input. I'll say, you got to predict something. So you better get depolarized and be in the predictive state. You may get fired based on the sequence of events. And you may get into a different state of, you may become active at a certain point of time. So this is again more of a simple representation of the sequence memory. So taking the example over here, right? Again, there are maybe say 2000 bits over here. Each of them is getting represented. There are two different layers that we are looking at. And then based on that, if you look at the different possibilities, right? The way you represent A could be possible in so many different ways. If you just look at 40 active bits in 10 cells per column, there are 10 raised to 40, not 0 raised to 40, 10 raised to 40 different ways that you can represent the same input. Now, that input is in one context. A, I could be representing as a grade or a letter of an alphabet. Both of them are different. Right? So those different contexts, again, do come into picture. So there are multiple different ways I can represent A also in a particular SDR. Here's an example. If I'm getting into an environment or I'm looking at something which I absolutely have no idea about, then there is no prediction, which means that the first bottom left corner that you see, all red columns. So there is no prediction. All the cells become active, doesn't know what to do. And that just feeds that information forward. But in the second case, when I know I'm touching the table, there is some level of prediction that is happening based on that. So there is some feed forward and there is a feedback as well that's coming out of here. And in that case, only the predicted columns or predicted cells in those columns would get activated. So here's another example. Say there's no training. I don't know ABCD. I'm just a kid born, don't know ABCD, XY, XBCY, any of those letters. So pretty much everything is activated over there. But once the training happens, once I know A, I may be able to predict B. Sorry, this is not an example of the first time learning, it's a sequence example. I made a mistake over there. So we are talking about a sequence prediction. So once you predict A, B, C, D should follow. So in this case, there is no sequence learning that has already happened. Once you look at what happens after the training, right? Once A is predicted, can predict B very easily. And at that point of time, only certain representations are done. And you can now predict B more accurately. And you have a model of that already available. So then only a certain set of cells are getting activated over there. Similarly, from B, you can predict C, C to D. Again, this is one sequence. Above that, the B which is represented is in a different context. It's a part of a different sequence where it says X, B, C, Y. Right? Notice that the B represented over here versus the B represented over there are different. Different bits are activated over there in the SGR. That's because it's a different context. So the way brain works, right? We are training each and every record. We are trying to understand and create a sensory motor world, sensory motor map of the world. We're trying to record every transaction. But the way, again, it works is that if we see something that we already understand, it reinforces our learning. And if we don't see that repeated pattern, we probably let it go if we are trying to learn something. Right? So it's a reinforcement learning problem that we typically see even in the machine learning world. The learning is essentially the formation of, again, this different synapses, and the way the synapses interact or activate the cells is how the storage really happens. So that was kind of, I know a whole lot of things, a brief summary of the research that's going on in this world, but I hope it gave at least a high level idea. And if you want to dig deeper into this, I would say just Google Numenta. They have a bunch of information out there. They've been doing great work in this field. The thought process is slightly different from the traditional world. The number of layers are debatable at this time. A lot of it is still a theory, but based on this theory, there are some practical models already built, some practical algorithms already built, and the idea behind this is to create a universal algorithm. So you don't really have to create models for each and every case, but a universal algorithm which you just throw at it, it would work like brain and it would just learn everything in the world and be able to do the predictions. So that's the higher goal. Yes. There's a small organization called Numenta, Numenta. It's in the US, yes, California. Sure. So some of it is still to be experimented, right? Some of it is based on the observation. Some of it is based on the actual experiments being done on the animals. And some of it is based on learning of the simulation that really happens. So I talked to one of my friends, he's a neuroscientist, and luckily he happens to be my school time friend. So I talked to him as well to understand this in detail. And he told me that it's basically the imaging of the brain based on certain simulations. They look at how the neurons are getting fired and they try to do an inference out of it. Certain part of it is more of an assumption that the brain knows the location. Now that is an assumption. It's not really experimented, but it knows the location that I'm going to touch here. That's how it's able to predict. So that part is more of an assumption. It needs to be validated, but it has to be true to some extent for it to work the way it works. So it's a combination of all three different things. Yes. So it does not actually. Yeah. Yeah, sure. The question is that how does this algorithm differ from person to person? So the theory is that it does not. It's basically the same brain structure across all the human beings. And it's basically the learnings that you go through and that's what forms your opinions, your experiences, your learnings, right? You are basically training. Think of it like a training model. You, there are certain parts which are automatically trained, which are autonomous behaviors, feelings, etc., etc. But when it comes to actual learnings, it's basically the learning from the surroundings that you get, and that if I may extend, this is not something that any researchers has put in there, but I believe that's how we form our personalities, we form our learnings, and we based on our interactions with the world, right? That is the context, right? Because you infer those things based on the context of your life experiences. So that is where I think the sequential memory comes in. You look at the same thing in different ways because of a certain point of reference or a context that you have. But the learning is always in a context, and that context is continuously getting set as you right from the childhood, right from being a baby maybe. That context is being set. That's how you look at something. People say that, right, truth is nothing but the way you look at it, in a way. So there are difference of opinions, or a single thing could be looked upon it by different ways. I think that's where the sequential memory comes into picture. Maybe a very high order sequential memory, not 4 or 5 or 6 layers, maybe thousands of layers in there. Sure. Okay. Probably I don't have enough knowledge to answer that with an authority, but I would say that it needs to be seen. There are lots of different theories, right? The original theories around the neural networks and the way we are modeling our systems are around neural networks. This is a slightly different concept. So I think it needs to be seen which one works the best. Till date, we don't really have a very good idea of how the brain works. We probably know 10-20% of how the brain works. So unless we really solve that problem, and again, the theory over here is to map the computer intelligence on the human intelligence. Right now, the other ways the intelligence has been already working to some extent, it's more of programmatic in a way, but that's still more manually fed in a way. The idea over here is that look at the human intelligence and the way it works with a universal algorithm, create a similar algorithm in the computer world as well, which would do this learning. So whether it works or not, or to what degree it works, I think there are some commercial applications based on this theory. So it does work, but does it really work to the extent that we believe, or no? That needs to be seen. So there is some truth to this, but not maybe we haven't really understood the human intelligence to its entirely detailed level to make sense out of it fully. Sure. Okay, thank you very much.